Since we're going to resume the hearing, Dr. Koroshetz had to leave due to a previously scheduled engagement, so we excuse him from the panel of witnesses. During the break, we're going to resume with questions. Mr. Jones, we'll go to you, and then when all members have had a chance to ask questions for the first round, I'll ask mine.
Okay. Mr. Chairman, thank you for holding the hearing, and Mr. Kennedy, thank you for your leadership on this issue regarding mental health, but also the mental health of our soldiers and their families. I want to very briefly, again, I talked about Camp Lejeune. A year ago, Dr. Kenyon Mannion, a psychiatrist, was released from his contract at Camp Lejeune. Because of that, I asked for an investigation, and the IG is investigating his situation, but also from that situation, it has kind of expanded. Tom Bigosi was a sergeant, a Marine sergeant that had been overseas twice, and he was in the mental health counseling at Camp Lejeune. It was PTSD, excuse me. At one point, 3 months ago, he left the clinic at Camp Lejeune, and on McHugh Boulevard, he stopped his car and committed suicide at 11:30 in the morning. I want to ask you experts, I'm a little bit from neurosciences to this point, do you believe that the military mental health system could be helped if there was a national committee set up to evaluate military mental health, to make recommendations to the Department of Defense and to the Congress? And the reason I bring this up, because I've been very impressed with you, your professionals, your experts into an area that I'm not. But as a layman who has a military district in his base in his district, and seeing the pain and the hurt that I've seen over the last few years. Last story, and then I would appreciate your answer about what can we do to strengthen military mental health. Can you imagine being able to speak at an elementary school at Camp Lejeune, Johnson Elementary School, National Reading Day, we're home because of the Easter break. I'm reading Dr. Seuss to 12 kids sitting on the floor. And as I take questions at the end of it, I say, you can ask me anything. The questions went, have you seen the president? Do you have a wife? Do you have a dog? Those kind of things. The last child, these are 6-year-old children. The last child, I said, this is my last question. He looked up at me and he said, my daddy's not dead yet. My daddy's not dead yet. Out of the mouth of a 6-year-old child. Now I want to come back to what would be my only question of you. Are we at a point that the Congress needs to say to the President, whomever he is, or maybe one day she, we need to put together a mental health commission of experts like yourself at the table to help our military develop a strong mental health program, whether we be at war or we be at peace. Does this have any validity? Because what I'm hearing, I know hyperbaric oxygen treatment. We've now finally got it down at Camp Lejeune. It's not work. It's not. They don't have the staff yet. But it seems like we're doing everything we can to deal with the mental health of our military, particularly those at war. But yet, it seems like there are just so many different aspects of it that somebody's got to kind of bring it together and have it focus. Does it make sense to have a commission to recommend to the military, to the Congress, to the President of what we need to do to make the mental health program in our military stronger and better for the families?
Well, sir, I'll start off. I think we need to work hard to leverage our existing collaborations right now that we have, and they're very strong and they're very robust with the VA and NIH. I mean, I've tried in my statement to focus on some examples, and in my written statement I have more examples. But I think from my professional point of view as a psychologist, I think the place to start is to work hard to leverage the existing relationships and collaborations that we have thus far with NIH and the VA on this issue of family studies specific to the military.
Walter, could I interject here?
Yes, sir.
Do we have standard data points for TBI so that we can collaborate, so that a scientist from Rhode Island can talk to a scientist in his district on neuroscience? Because apparently in the second testimony that we heard, that we don't, from Dr. Koresh's testimony, there is no standard TBI data input. So how can you talk about collaboration?
Well, sir, that's a good point. Now, remember that when we talk about traumatic brain injury, we're talking about a pretty broad spectrum. So that can range from mild in concussion to severe and penetrating, and everything in between. There's a lot of differences in there. So it's a very broad spectrum. I'll turn it over to my colleagues, and if they have a different view of the range of TBI, they can.
Well, I think the whole purpose here, as Walter is saying, is that we're all in it together. Civilian research can benefit veteran research. It's not a veteran.
Oh, absolutely.
Right. So, but if we don't have common data points, and there's TBIs every night of the week from car accidents, and we can't collect anything that's useful to the veteran in terms of recovery, response, function, how can we be saying we're in it to win it for the vets? I mean, but Tom, you've got the blueprint at the NIH for collaboration.
Right. So the blueprint has developed of these programs for collaboration, and as Walter Koroshet's mentioned, there's a real interest in what they're calling common data elements, which the Neurology Institute is putting out for all investigators to use for each of the disorders that they support. So that, I think, will be an important resource. But if I may, could I go back to your original question? Because I think the perspective that you're describing is just very different from the personal experience I've had with as a civilian.
Sure.
Representing a government agency dealing with the leadership in the Pentagon. And I have to say this as clearly as I can, that the level of commitment to reducing suicide, to ensuring that resilience is supported, and to changing culture is greater amongst the leadership in the Pentagon than anything I've ever seen in the civilian sector. These people really believe that this is their highest priority right now. They are very concerned about this issue. I have never seen that level of concern from anyone in the civilian sector, where in fact the suicide rate continues to take 34,000 lives a year. So I think, I mean, I understand your wish to be helpful, but I do think that it underestimates what's already happening from an administration that really wants to make a difference here and is looking for answers quickly and is trying out things quickly to try to bring this rate down and to try to make life better for soldiers in active duty.
Mr. Chairman, can I speak just very quickly and I'll finish?
Go ahead.
I have great respect for the military. I didn't serve, but I have great respect. But this hyperbaric oxygen treatment that has been studied for years and years and years by the military, and that's why they put a chamber down at Camp Lejeune they're going to continue to study. I found out, talked to two people, Bud Day, one was awarded the Medal of Honor in Vietnam for this country. He was so distraught about his grandson who had been severely injured, TBI, down in, that he paid for him to go to the hyperbaric oxygen program at LSU. I called him. He said, my son is just remarkably recovered. He can function now. He's not on drugs. So your point, I don't disagree with you, but this still is, now I'm not saying it's the only treatment. You're the scientist, I'm not, but I have talked to 3 different individuals, including a General Manny down at Florida. You know him, you're smiling, so you do know who I'm talking about. He was under the treatment at Walter Reed for months and months and months, so no improvement. His wife talked to the doctor at Walter Reed, and she went to, I think it was George Washington Med School, and the doctor actually gave a prescription for him to be in the hyperbaric treatment program there. This man's been in my office. He's been elected a state judge. He's functioning 110%. But if he had stayed in the military, they would have kept him probably drugged for quite a bit of his life and with no real improvement. So that's my concern. I don't fault anybody in the military. I think they do a magnificent job. But somewhere when you talk about can't get the word out today, working together, let me say it that way. When you're talking about bringing people together, I just wonder if as Patrick was saying, is there a formula that we can have for the military to know what is available without having people try to duplicate other studies? I just don't know, and that's the reason I want to sit here today, and with that I yield back, but I thank you.
Well, Walter, you hit the nail. There isn't, to answer your question, because there aren't common data points in TBI, which is a signature wound on the war, to help us instruct on whether those are injuries that affect and increase suicide rates. And just as of September 24th, I appreciate Tom standing up for his compatriots who were working hard, but the Walter Reed Army Hospital's Chief of Psychiatry, Colonel John Bradley, said shoddy training and coordination has left us a failure in taking on suicides in the military, from his own words. So I appreciate your standing up for him, but when we don't have the lead expert on mental health and suicides, not differentiate between this, or differentiate psychological from neurological, after your testimony saying it's all neurological, you got a big problem here.
I'm going to ask the gentleman to hold some of that for the next round of questions. I've got some questions.
Good.
And then we can, we're going to have one more round, which the gentleman may lead off again.
Thank you.
Dr. Insall. I want to talk to you about the nature of stress. Stress produces chemicals which affect the brain. Isn't that right?
Correct.
And can an abundance of stress in certain individuals bring about organic brain changes?
We know that some of the stress hormones alter the way in which cells are born and cells die within the brain. So there's every reason to think that stress does have direct effects on the health of the brain. You'll be able to hear a lot more about this from Dr. Akil, who's in the next panel, who's really one of the world's experts on this.
Is there an area of the brain where frequent stress breaks down inhibition towards suicide?
Well, a lot of the research is focused on the effect of stress on an area called the hippocampus, which is certainly very important for higher cortical function, for memory, for the way in which memories get encoded in the brain. But the relationship of stress to brain anatomy or brain morphology and suicide remains now a very vague one. There are a lot of gaps in our understanding of how these things connect.
Well, you know, I asked this question because if it's not site-specific, then the work of someone like Carl Prebaum, his holonomic theory, comes into play. I'm sure you're familiar with his theories.
So there are the places where stress is likely to have the greatest impact is where the receptors for hormones like cortisol are found in the brain, and they're not everywhere. There are areas that are highly enriched, and those are the places that we look, and in fact, those are the places where we see changes. But again, there's a gap here between our understanding of the cellular effects of stress and our understanding of what causes suicide. It's a very complicated area when you try to predict, for instance, who's likely to take their own life. We know some of the factors from a population, but within an individual person, we're not very good yet at being able to have high levels of prediction.
I heard you in response to observation by my friend from North Carolina indicate the work that's being done in the Department of Defense on matters relating to suicide. You did say that, correct?
Right, this is a joint project between NIMH and DoD.
What's ironic about that, if I may, is that the stressor in this case is war. There's a duh factor about this. The latest book about President Obama and the Afghanistan war indicates the tension between the administration and the White House, or rather the administration and the Pentagon, and the difficulty that the administration was having in having the Pentagon produce a plan to exit the war. And I think that my friend from North Carolina would agree. You can study the nature of suicide all you want, but if you've got increased suicide that's coming from people who are in combat under horrendous conditions where there's all kinds of atrocities being committed, how smart do you have to be to figure this out?
That's right.
You know, so I appreciate that you're studying it, but it would be more productive, I think, if a group of scientists would come forward and have the opportunity to do some real tests on how stress breaks down people and how that puts them in that soft circumference of suicidal ideation, which then may lead to people acting and taking their own life. You know, so you can't really speak to that because that's not your area of decision making. But no matter what how caring the people in the Pentagon are about the troops, as long as you're sending people into this mixed master of war, you're going to end up with suicides. I mean, that's, you know, again, I don't think you have to be a neurophysiologist to understand this. I don't think you have to be a cognitive psychologist or cognitive neuroscientist to understand this. War is, you know, we put these young people into an impossible situation. They're killing themselves. You know, I don't deserve a PhD for that observation. Now, is it true, Dr. Insel, that certain approaches to neuroscience necessarily depend on a mechanistic view of human beings?
I'm not sure I understand your question.
Well, like Skinnerian approach, stimulus response. Behaviorism, you know, if you induce certain stimuli, you get a certain effect. Are you a student of that particular type of neuroscience?
Well, that actually falls into a category of what we would call behavioral science. So it really has to do with predicting behavior based on stimulus and response. And one of the things that's perhaps most conspicuous about that is it leaves out the brain. So neuroscientists tend to think more about the mechanisms by which behavior gets regulated, and they tend to be a little more complicated than just a simple...
Complicated, that's a good word. So tell me about it.
The complications of how we predict behavior. Again, I'm I need a little help here in terms of what it is you're
Well, is
looking
it, you
for.
know, there's a, when you talk about neuroscience, you can take an almost linear view. And I'm interested as, you know, as compared with cognitive neuroscience, which encompasses the possibilities of quantum physics interfacing with neuroscience, where you actually create the potential of change that cannot necessarily be explained by this, by the more linear progression of a more mechanical approach. Does that not register with you at all?
So I think what
If it doesn't, I'll withdraw the question.
Well, I'm not sure I heard the question, but if the question is, does neuroscience provide a basis for approaching that complexity and trying to understand that complexity, I think the answer is yes. I think we have the tools now, many of which come from very different fields, such as higher math or from physics, from dealing with large amounts of information, that we are able to actually begin to make sense of the complexity of how the brain works with models that become predictive.
Mhm.
So we have a long way to go, but I would say that we've come a very long way from a simple Skinnerian model of stimulus and response.
That's good to hear, because every component of the philosophy of science carries with it part of the headlong momentum of some of the early thinking within those disciplines. So I just wondered where a Skinnerian view fits in.
In the testimony that I gave, Mr. Chairman, I used the term disruptive innovations. And from my perspective, this last decade has been a series of truly disruptive innovations as we've begun to understand, to go back to Congressman Kennedy's point, that the brain really is the gateway to understanding the mind. And I don't believe that we had fully appreciated that in previous decades.
Just want to conclude by saying that it may have been in, I don't think it was in your testimony, but maybe in your colleague who just had to leave, spoke of the light shining on microbial membranes that opened up new channels. Is that what you're talking about?
Well, that's a technique which has been used to be able to study circuitry in the brain in a very precise way.
But I mean, I think you understand the comparison I'm making, and that is that if you use light as a metaphor here, shining itself on certain membranes, opening up new channels. It's a metaphor for the possibilities of neuroscience to go into areas which would make the work that you're working out right now seem primitive in years to come. With all due respect, I'm a fan of neuroscience's capabilities, and so I appreciate your presence here.
Thank you. If I may, just as a final comment about this, I think it needs to be said we're in the middle of a revolution.
Yeah.
And in 20 to 30 years, we'll look back on this period to realize how little we knew. But the tools are there to transform the way we think about the brain. And as someone said in the opening comments, this is really the last great frontier of science. And for the first time, I think we have the discovery tools that we've needed to really explore and to colonize that frontier in a different way.
Just one other question occurs to me. I don't know if you're able to answer this, but the phenomenon of fear, the emotion of fear, I've seen some studies that suggest that it originates in the limbic system. Is that right?
We use the term mediated by
the
yes.
limbic system, and is that really, on an evolutionary standpoint, part of what some might call part of the reptilian brain, the flight or fight syndrome?
Yeah, those are models that we have kind of given up a few years ago, but the idea of having
Well, I'm talking about the kind of the
that sort of core
archaeology of your
right, that
discipline.
of core ancient part of the brain, which feeds into those kinds of fight or flight impulses.
Since you work with and since people in the neuroscience discipline work with the Department of Defense, is anyone doing any studies about the potential of transformation beyond fear, which often puts people into this fight or flight, which is a precursor for inevitably, on a macrocosmic level, the precursor of war? I mean, does anybody ever think about that?
I'm not sure that we're where you are on these on this idea. So there's a tremendous amount of research right now on the fundamental neurobiology of fear and fear responses, and particularly what we call extinction, the ability to overcome fear. But the relationship of that to war is a place where I think most neuroscientists haven't gone.
Thank you. Mr. Kennedy, second round.
Thank you. I think the most significant issue is how to do the research so we make the most of what we know. It's not how much we know, it's how much we don't know that we know. And that gets back to the common data points for TBI. We can't do the data mining and find out what's working or what isn't if there isn't common language and nomenclature. You have a blueprint at NIH. Does that blueprint include DoD and VA? And if not, why not? And to Dr. Coopersmith, do you have, along with the DoD and Terry, the ability to have a common program, computer program to input, these data points, or not? First, Tom.
So just very quickly, we do have a blueprint, which is consortium of, I think, 15 institutes and centers at NIH for some common projects. It's a fairly limited effort. It's identifying areas of common need and pushing ahead on a few of those. It does not involve DoD, VA, or many of the other institutes at NIH even, so it is truly a kind of homegrown project, but it hasn't in any way inhibited many of the institutes, my own included, NIMH, from these very large collaborations. As I said, the biggest project we're doing is the collaboration with DoD, and it's really become our signature project for 2010. It probably will be for the next few years. So the blueprint's not part of that, but it almost doesn't need to be. We've got a lot going on just out of the institute itself.
But we don't have a program that allows for all this data to be put in, so we're all scientists in one area of the country can find out what the scientists in the other areas of the country is doing, so we can work to a greater effect to everybody's advantage. We don't have that.
We don't have a single data repository at this point for other than for autism. I don't think that exists for any area that our institute's working in.
Would it be useful to everybody? I know you have these collaborations and it's helpful, but could we dedicate funding that would leverage what the institutes do by giving a little money to help bring them and their work together to help and maximize each other in a coordinated way?
So we have done that in autism, and I think it's been transformative. We have an opportunity now for virtually every project to flow into the same database called the National Database for Autism Research, and that's a model that could be followed in a number of areas.
That's terrific. Dr. Cooper-Smith?
Our computers have not merged yet with DoD, but there's a tremendous amount of work on that, and that is a goal, certainly of this administration. But our computer system evolved out of a clinical computer system, sort of from the ground up, with investigators creating software merging into a large system. So that is clearly a goal of this administration. It's not a research topic per se, although research will benefit greatly from it.
That's what I'm
And
talking
we are looking forward to be able to do that.
Because if we don't know what we know, we're
Right.
just doomed to repeat the science.
Absolutely. And I think that quotes Albert Einstein, actually.
Well, you know, I like to often get confused for him and my intellectual interpretations for things.
But there is very hard work, as many know, is going on that. Very important.
Well, thank you. And Terry, what would you say, Dr. Rausch, about the need to get DOD to help open up what Tom has in his NIH and what the VA, and make it all so everybody's helping to a common effort, both soldiers benefiting, but then civilian, and civilians benefiting from soldier, and vice versa.
Yeah, you make a very good point, sir. We are working on it. We have a collaborative effort with VA, NIH, DOD, Department of Education. It's called the Common Data Elements Project. And its purpose is to do exactly what you charged us to do, and that is to standardize terminology within TBI and the Psych Health portfolio. It's in development, it's in progress, but it has started. And you know, I think I probably need to take this for the record and give you some more information, because your question really deserves a more detailed answer, and I'd like to provide more detail on the Common Data Elements Project for TBI and Psych Health.
Super, super. Well, thank you. And that's what the hearing's about. What can we do in Congress to help leverage what you're already doing and what the science shows us out there already?
Congressman Kennedy, there's a person by the name of George Foray, who's was a physicist and is a philosopher, and he spoke to science as a structure-specific language constructed for the representation of what there is. And so semantics do count, because they link through their expression to specific structures that help either to confirm pre-existing notions of a science or disconfirm them. So the point that you raised about the nomenclature is not a small matter. It's actually quite significant, not just for the subject of a particular type of behavior, but there are broader social implications. Now, are you done?
I just repeat, Tom, what you said. You go fast, go alone, but go far, you go together. But we need to go far together, but we need to go faster. And if you can provide us some recommendations from your point of view as to what FDA can do, since they're integral and whenever it comes up from your researchers, if we get a finding right into the field for our soldier and our veteran, that would be very useful if you could give us some ideas on regulatory science. Again, this is process issues, as you just said, Dr. Coopersmith. It doesn't involve the science, but the science can't be maximized unless you get the process right. So if you could provide us some input on that, as you have already in your testimony, it helps us make a better case politically. If we just put some dollars here, we leverage a whole bunch. If we work as a team, we get further. And your blueprint's the perfect. How do we institutionalize that more? Get the common data sets and standardized terminology together. And so that would be useful.
Thank you, Congressman Kennedy. I just have a couple of brief questions. We'll go to our next panel. One of you gentlemen brought up nutrition. Was it you, Mr. Rausch? In what context did you bring that up?
I brought that up in the context of nutritional interventions in the whole Psych Health, TBI, PTSD portfolio, to include looking at nutraceuticals. And that's an area in which we have a number of projects that we're funding.
John Robbins, the author, has written extensively about the impact, adverse impact on human health of certain types of foods. Plenty of research about the adverse impact on physical and mental states of, let's say, consuming large amounts of sugar. We know it's true of large amounts of salt. There have been studies done on prison populations whose diets have changed, and it has a change in the diet produced changes in their emotional states, made them actually less aggressive. I mean, I think that the potential for neuroscience making a great contribution is there. There's no question about it, and it's really urgent that we use whatever means we have available to help fulfill this potential. So I want to thank the members of the first panel for your commitment in your respective disciplines, for the thoughtful testimony and question answering that you've provided. This is an area which Congressman Kennedy, I think that in the next Congress, we ought to be thinking about doing some follow-up hearings. And we ought to think about...
I'll be sitting back there, Mr. Chairman, looking up at you.
You'll always be welcome, because I think that, what you've done is you have, through you becoming involved in this, we've become aware there are examples of research collaboration between and among federal agencies. And what you've done is to remind the people in the community that it's important to collaborate with each other, and whether it's done on an ad hoc process or on a regular basis, I think that it is and can be productive because of the synergy that always comes from interdisciplinary thinking. And so I would urge that approach of interdisciplinary thinking to continue through encouraging all the parties to this to keep talking if they are, and to start talking together if they're not, and to I think it's a good idea to work collaboratively with your friends in Congress who will advocate on your behalf in the appropriate venues. So thank you for being here, and good luck with your work, and we're going to call the second panel. Well, the second panel is getting into place. I want to thank them and the members of the audience for their patience because of the congressional voting schedule. We've had kind of a prolonged hearing here, and your willingness to come here to offer testimony, answer questions is much appreciated. I'm going to introduce our second panel. Dr. Huda Akil, PhD, is the Gardner Quarton Distinguished University Professor of Neuroscience and Psychiatry and the co-director of the Molecular and Behavioral Neuroscience Institute at the University of Michigan. Dr. Akil has made seminal contributions to the understanding of brain biology of emotions, including pain, anxiety, depression, and substance abuse. Dr. Akil has received several awards for her research and is past president of the Society for Neuroscience. Thank you, Dr. Akil, for your presence. William Z. Potter, MD and PhD, spent 25 years at the National Institute of Health, focused on translational neuroscience. While at the NIH, Dr. Potter developed a wide reputation as an expert in pharmacological sciences and championed the development of novel treatments for CNS disorders. In 2004, Dr. Potter joined Merck Research Labs as VP of Clinical Neuroscience and assumed the newly created position of VP of Translational Neuroscience in 2006, a position from which he retired in January of this year. Thank you very much, Dr. Timothy Coetzee, is that right? PhD, is the Executive Director of Fast Forward LLC, the National Multiple Sclerosis Society's Drug Discovery and Development Affiliate. In this capacity, Dr. Coetzee is responsible for the Society's strategic funding of early-stage biotechnology and pharmaceutical companies engaged in discovery and development of new treatments and diagnostic tools for multiple sclerosis. Thank you, sir. Kevin Kit Parker, PhD, is the Thomas D. Cabot Associate Professor of Applied Science and Associate Professor of Biomedical Engineering in the School of Engineering and Applied Sciences at Harvard. Professor Parker is the Director of the Disease Biophysics Group and a member of the Systems Biology Department at Harvard Medical School, the Harvard Stem Cell Institute, and the Harvard MIT Health Sciences and Technology Program. He's also a major in the Rhode Island Army National Guard and has completed 2 combat tours in Afghanistan with the 82nd Airborne and the 10th Mountain Divisions. Thank you for being here, sir. John H. Morrison, PhD, is the Dean of Basic Science and a graduate in the Graduate School of Biological Science at Mount Sinai School of Medicine. Before becoming dean, he served as the chair of neuroscience. Dr. Morrison is also professor of neuroscience and the Willard T.C. Johnson Professor of Geriatrics and Adult Development in Neurobiology of Aging. Thank you. This is a distinguished panel, as with the last one. It's our policy in this committee on government oversight and reform to swear in all witnesses before they testify. I would ask that the witnesses stand, raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Thank you. Let the record reflect that each of the witnesses has answered in the affirmative. As with the members of the first panel, I'd ask you to try to keep your remarks to 5 minutes. And as with the members of the first panel, I let them go on because they had some things to say that were very important. So,
in that regard, Mr. Chairman, I just want to thank everybody who showed up today. All of you represent different organizations, groups, been very useful in helping put this hearing together. I want to thank Zach Lynch from the Neurotechnology Industry Organization, been very useful in helping to put together some very helpful statistics and points for us in the hearing. And just say we wish we could get everybody up here because everybody in this audience, from looking out in the audience, I'm familiar with in this field. But just appreciate that we understand and have incorporated a lot of your recommendations and suggestions into the hearing, and thank everybody for being here today.
okay, thank you. Dr. Akil, you may begin. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Kennedy, distinguished members of the committee, thank you for this opportunity to testify here today. I wanted to mention that beyond my service in the as past president of the Society for Neuroscience, I am a member of the Council of the Institute of Medicine and its Forum on Neuroscience. I'm also a co-chair of the steering committee of the Biomarkers Consortium at the Foundation for NIH. I currently hold funding from the NIH, the Office of Naval Research, and the Pritzker Foundation to conduct work on the biology of stress, emotions, addiction, and mood disorder. And as an aside, given the discussion in the earlier period, we are studying in the Pritzker Consortium the brains of people who were depressed and committed suicide versus the brains of people who did not, and whether they were being treated or not. And we're beginning to get some insights to your question about where in the brain the changes might happen. That's not the focus of my testimony today, but I'm happy to answer questions about it. So as we've heard, the global burden of brain disease is staggering, and the challenge of understanding, preventing, and curing brain disorders is still very much before us. Today, what I wanted to do is outline what I believe to be the central grand challenge of neuroscience, one that I've been talking about, and I would like to suggest a couple of strategies for meeting it. Our brain contains 100 billion cells that communicate via 500 trillion connections or synapses. And the point of all this communication is to orchestrate brain activity. Each brain cell is a breathtaking piece of biological machinery, but a single cell can never perceive beauty or feel sadness or solve a mathematical problem. Through the magic of integration, completely new capabilities emerge when networks of brain cells come together to form brain circuits, each of which performs specific functions such as vision, hunger, cognition, emotions. I call this neural choreography. By the time a brain disorder is evident, it has affected not a single group of cells, but the entire circuit. It's the disruption of the whole network that leads to the symptoms of the illnesses that we are concerned about. The problem is not that a ballerina has stumbled, but that the choreography of the whole ensemble has fallen apart. So when we're thinking about the impact of brain injury on movement, the exaggerated response to a threat signal in a soldier with PTSD, the drug compulsion in an addict, the confusion about reality in a psychotic patient, we have to think about disrupted brain circuits, neural choreography gone awry. And our grand challenge is to understand the workings of a brain circuit and learn how it controls itself. As Dr. Insel has indicated, we know the elements of many of these circuits, but we need to watch them perform in real life, in real time, and discover how their choreography fails and how that causes disease. The idea that brain disorders are the results of faulty brain circuits also explains why it's been so hard to uncover genetic causes of some disorders that we know to be very heritable, like bipolar illness. It's because the symptoms that clinicians diagnose are manifestations of a disrupted brain circuit, and there are countless ways to screw that up. So different families can suffer from completely different genetic problems and still share the same medical diagnosis. And it's like any given dancer in the troupe can fail and disrupt the whole dance. But the choreography idea also means that there are multiple ways to repair the problem. We don't need to devise a new treatment for each family. We need to learn how to retune the circuits, the networks. So how do we take on the neural choreography challenge? My inspiration for tackling it comes from the brain itself, the creation of well-orchestrated networks of scientists who work together to achieve what can never be achieved separately. This effort needs to be grounded in some hard-earned realities. In the words of President Kennedy, we need to be idealists without illusions. Understanding the brain and mind is hard, and we need help, not only from each other, but from our colleagues in math, physics, chemistry, and engineering. We also need to engage our friends in the social sciences, since our brains are constantly being remodeled by our social environment. But the knowledge that can emerge from such networks can be transformative, and the discoveries unimaginable. I've suggested in my written testimonies 3 types of integration: horizontal integration, where a large number of investigators with the same general expertise focus on a given slice of a problem, for example, validating biomarkers of a disrupted brain circuit, say in PTSD. Vertical integration among different types of scientists who are focusing on a scientific question or disorder and trying to solve it from molecule to mind and back. And neural choreography is right in the middle of that path. And finally, 2-dimensional integration that represents special large-scale projects that combine vertical and horizontal efforts. The goal would be to advance our fundamental knowledge of neural circuitry and relate the discoveries not to one disease, but to several disorders. But whatever the model, rather than being entirely investigator-driven or agency-driven, I believe that this process needs to arise from a partnership between the scientific community and the federal agencies. To get buy-in and to define the specific approaches that would be most fruitful. So in summary, understanding the brain and healing it when it is sick may well be the most difficult challenge that humanity has ever undertaken. We need to give this amazing organ its due by bringing together every tool we have at our disposal and working together to probe its mysteries. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Potter.
Yes. Mr. Chairman, Mr. Kennedy, and members of the committee, I'm speaking from the perspective of a retired officer in the Public Health Service and practicing psychiatrist. And I served in intramural programs of the National Institutes of Mental Health for 25 years, and I've just retired from the pharmaceutical industry, where for the last 15 years I worked with a couple of big companies, Eli Lilly and Merck, which had big investments in CNS drugs. And despite the sensational advances in neuroscience during this period and the explosion of sophisticated technologies you've been hearing about, we have not delivered truly novel drugs for diseases of the brain. Arguably, the current generation of psychiatric medications for treating schizophrenia, depression, and severe anxiety are no more effective than the first generation of medications discovered over 50 years ago, and those by accident. The assumption back in the 80s at all levels of government and industry was that that scientific explosion would rapidly lead to more effective treatments, but that was overly optimistic. If anything, the opposite has been the case. It's become much more difficult to develop the novel targets that were identified, and to bring a single new entity to market now costs, on average, $1.8 billion, which is actually a pretty conservative estimate of the real cost. The new drugs, and this is for all drugs, new drugs for brain diseases emerge at even a lower rate and prove more expensive to develop and carry extremely high risk. So what went wrong with our predictions from the 80s? And as Dr. Ensel has pointed out, we have a new revolution to incorporate into our future thinking. So what went wrong was the assumptions were too simple, as Dr. Keel has currently addressed. And so the complexity at both the genetic and physiological level was much greater than we ever anticipated, and we did not have the maps or navigational tools to go through all of this data and pick out the right targets. So what we're up against, sort of this wall of what we call target validation. What are the right things to make drugs for? Instead of a few drug targets, we have hundreds now that we need to sort through. And it requires to sort through a single one that we think might be valid. It takes an average of almost over 13 to 14 years, and get it through regulatory review and through the market if you are in the business of the industry. And for the central nervous system area, at best, 1 in 20 of things that we take into this very expensive and long development actually deliver. So obviously, with that sort of numbers, it is not possible for the pharmaceutical industry to survive by investing in the CNS field without a huge paradigm shift. Given the long development times in the current laws, most drugs will have 10 years or less of patent protection by the time you've been through this. And ironically, the Me Too drugs, which are easier to develop, actually are the ones that enjoy the longer patent protection. So the incentive structure actually rewards coming up with Me Too drugs and says, don't waste your money on coming up with novel, better drugs. But this is basically why many companies have reduced their investment. So in one area, we have an exception, fortunately, and that is around the field of Alzheimer's. And there, both the NIH, clinical scientists, patient advocacy groups, philanthropies, the FDA and industry joined together under this remarkable effort sponsored by the National Institute of Aging called the Alzheimer's Disease Neuroimaging Initiative. And in keeping with some of what Mr. Kennedy has already discussed, the findings become available on computer, available all in the public domain as soon as the data is gathered and processed. This ADNI model has taken hold worldwide and is currently trying to be implemented in the European Union, Japan, Australia, and Korea. And fundamentally, their governments have said this area of translational medicine and the tools and the data sharing necessary to support it are national priorities. We use this term translational medicine to cover all this science and technology to help us translate the basic science that Dr. Akil was talking about into something that